The last thing that Adolf Hitler wanted in the spring of 1941 was a war in the Balkans. His mind was full of the forthcoming invasion of Russia. But his fellow dictator Mussolini was in serious trouble, and German troops and aircraft were needed to prevent catastrophe. The Führer got more than he bargained for. Yugoslavia's stand against the Nazis was rewarded with instant invasion, but the German foray into the Balkans became more extensive as the Greeks doggedly resisted conquest. British attempts to help were unequal to the task, and further humiliation was to follow as German paratroopers seized Crete, inflicting yet another crushing defeat on the British Empire. Much of the blame for the Balkans War was Mussolini's. Jealous of Hitler's military triumphs, which confirmed Germany as the senior partner in the Axis alliance, Il Duce resolved to carve out his own place in the sun. Past military adventures had been restricted to targets unable to resist and with no friends to intervene. Libya, Abyssinia, and Albania were incorporated into his latter-day Roman Empire. This was achieved at the minor cost of international censure from the toothless League of Nations. Depicted by cartoonists as the opportunist jackal to the Nazi lion, Mussolini launched an invasion of his own, deliberately not informing Hitler until his armies were on the move. On the 28th of October 1940, Italy invaded Greece. Unfortunately for Mussolini, the Greek army was a very different prospect from the ill-equipped African tribesmen that his armies had defeated earlier. Not only did the Italian invasion break down that winter, a Greek counter-offensive in December drove the invaders 80 kilometers back into Albania. Mussolini's invasion of Greece infuriated Hitler. The German dictator was annoyed with the blatant disregard of his stated opinions on the subject and with its effect upon his own long-term plans. It soon became obvious that Hitler could not leave Mussolini's chestnuts merrily blazing in the fire, and pulling them out would necessarily be a military, not a political matter. Hitler had already laid plans for a drive down through Bulgaria to occupy the northeast coast of the Aegean. This was intended to secure the southern flank of his coming onslaught on Soviet Russia. The operation, code-named Marita, also provided for the conquest of the whole of mainland Greece, if necessary. But Hitler had hoped that the bonds between his own dictatorship and that of the Greek ruler, General Metaxas, would be sufficient to avoid actual battle. Hitler wanted a peaceful occupation, similar to those already in place in Romania and Hungary, and intended for Bulgaria. He also hoped for a peaceful solution to the problem posed by Yugoslavia. Even before the war started, Germany had arranged to take Yugoslavia's entire production of copper, plus substantial quantities of lead and zinc, in return for supplies of aircraft and guns. He summoned the Yugoslav foreign minister to Berchtesgaden on the 27th of November 1940 to suggest that Yugoslavia place herself unreservedly upon the side of the Axis. The Wehrmacht had been funneling troops into Hungary and Romania, allied to Germany by treaty, since the autumn of 1940. By February 1941, more than 650,000 were in place, primarily to secure the southern flank of the invasion of the USSR, which was planned for May. When it became necessary to take action against the Greeks, who were putting up a stiff fight against the Italians, Hitler bullied the Bulgarians and Yugoslavs into signing the Tripartite Pact. This allowed General Feldmarschall List's 12th Army to cross their borders on its way to Greece. Bulgaria was forced to allow the Wehrmacht free passage, and German forces began to assemble opposite the Metaxas line defenses that separated these ancient enemies. But an assault through Bulgaria would restrict the invasion to a relatively narrow front, which the Greeks were well prepared to resist. More Nazi browbeating secured permission from the Yugoslav government for German forces to cross their territory to attack Greece. But British troops were already landing in Greece. Bolstered by 2 Commonwealth infantry divisions, an armoured brigade and RAF Hurricanes, the Greeks prepared to meet the threatened invasion. On the 19th of March, Hitler gave Yugoslavia 5 days in which to agree to neutrality and the demilitarization of the Adriatic coast. Hitler made it quite obvious that if the Yugoslavs failed to sign, life would become increasingly difficult for them in the very near future. On the 25th of March, the Yugoslav foreign minister signed the pact at a ceremony so lacking in the festive spirit that even Hitler likened it to a funeral. Hitler's plans were disrupted within 48 hours. Hardline Serb officers organized a military coup in the name of the young King Peter, overthrowing his uncle, the regent, Prince Paul. When news of the coup reached Hitler, he thought at first that it was a joke. But amusement soon vanished, replaced by fury. He interrupted a meeting of Wehrmacht commanders. Within hours they had received new and unequivocal orders. There was to be no misunderstanding of the form Operation Punishment was to take. The Führer is determined to make all preparations for the destruction of Yugoslavia, militarily and as a national unit. Politically, it is especially important that the blow against Yugoslavia is carried out with pitiless harshness. The main task of the Luftwaffe is to start as early as possible and to destroy the capital city Belgrade in waves of attack. Spearheaded by Luftwaffe bomber and dive bomber attacks, General von Kleist's 14th Panzer Corps attacked towards Belgrade. At the same time, the Leibstandarte Adolf Hitler, an elite brigade of the SS, and the 9th Panzer Division drove through Macedonia towards Skopje. The aim was to block any possible union of the Yugoslav and the Greek armies. The German onslaught began on Palm Sunday, the 6th of April, with spectacular strikes by the Luftwaffe. The citizens of Belgrade were awakened by the noise of aircraft circling above them at 5:30 a.m. And within half an hour, bombs were raining down on the railway station, the Royal Palace, and the airfield at Zemun, where much of the Yugoslav Air Force was caught on the ground. For the whole of that day, the attack continued, until the center of Belgrade was reduced to rubble. By the following evening, 17,000 people had been killed, and fires continued to rage. "500 miles south, the menacing drone of approaching aircraft was heard in the Greek port of Piraeus. Soon afterwards, German bombers dropped mines at the harbour mouth. Then followed sticks of bombs which rained down across the water, shipping and warehouses along the harbour edge. One of the victims was the SS Glenn Fraser, anchored by the main quay. A bomb burst aboard her, and the 250 tons of explosives in her hold blew up with a shattering roar that devastated the port and smashed doors and windows in Athens 7 miles away. Back in Yugoslavia, the country splintered along its pre-1914 boundaries. 2 Croatian divisions mutinied, and a breakaway Croat republic welcomed the Germans into Zagreb while Belgrade burned. The Yugoslav government requested an armistice on the 14th of April. However, 2 separate groups of Serbs scattered into their barren mountains. Chetniks, loyal to the monarchy, and the communist partisans dominated by Josip Broz, the guerrilla leader known as Tito. The stage was set for an internecine war that continues to the present day. The German occupation of Yugoslavia opened a vicious can of worms. In general, the Croats supported the Germans. Indeed, Croatian Ustasi nationalists conducted a genocidal campaign against the Serbs in Croatia and Bosnia. Some Serbs, led by local quisling General Nedic, supported the Germans. Others, Mostly pro-royalist fragments of the army and gendarmerie took to the hills. Led by Draza Mihailovic, they adopted the old Serbian name of Chetnik, from Cheta or regiment. Initial Serbian resistance brought savage reprisals from the Germans. The going rate was 100 Serbs executed for each German killed. But the Chetniks were also deadly foes of the partisans, the communist rebels led by Tito. The Chetniks offered to come over to the German side to fight the communists, while continuing to fight the Croatian fascists who were being supplied by the Germans. The partisans were by far the most effective opposition to the Germans, and by the end of the war they claimed almost 200,000 men and women under arms. Although Tito himself was a Croat, he did more than any other Yugoslav to bring the war home to the Germans and their Croatian allies. Tito's partisan army won the support of the Western allies in preference to the unreliable Serbian Chetniks, since by their actions they tied down no less than 35 German divisions. Internal rivalries were often more important than resisting the invaders. Serb fought Croat, Chetnik fought partisan, and Muslims, Catholics and Orthodox killed each other with unbridled enthusiasm. The German attack on Greece was conceived as two main thrusts. A combined SS and armoured drive would turn south along the Albanian border, while List's 12th Army would attack through Macedonia, piercing or bypassing the Greek defensive lines. A smaller force was to make a series of landings on the Greek islands along the Turkish coast. The attack began on the 6th of April, with the 12th Army, commanded by Field Marshal List, advancing from Bulgaria with 3 corps. 30th and 48th Corps drove directly to the Aegean Sea, punching clean through the Greek defences. A British armoured brigade deployed in the north was ordered to fall back along the eastern coast. The German 40th Corps included 5th Panzer Division and 1st SS Division Leibstandarte Adolf Hitler. This force overran southern Yugoslavia to cross the Yugoslav-Greek frontier at Monastir on the 10th of April. Air power was a decisive factor. The Greeks had no means to oppose the Luftwaffe, and the British could not spare more than a token force of aircraft. Any attempt to move by day brought Stukas screaming out of the clear Mediterranean sky. Fighters joined in, and even bombers were used to strafe Allied road transport columns. It became so bad that drivers started to abandon their vehicles at the mere sound of aircraft approaching. When Allied ground troops turned to fight, their positions were subjected to a hail of bombs. Communications broke down, artillery and anti-tank positions were knocked out, fuel and ammunition failed to arrive, and the wounded had to be left behind. At the same time, the Italian army launched a new offensive to coincide with Hitler's intervention. Their forces in Albania had been resupplied and re-equipped, whereas the Greeks' logistic situation had not improved. Outgunned, outnumbered, and with the Germans pouring into northern Greece, the Greek army started to give way. Hitler's Directive Number 27 called for the encirclement of the Allied forces by a breakthrough in the direction of Larissa, the key road junction south of Mount Olympus. All north-south traffic east of the Pindus Mountains came through this junction. With 5th Panzer Division charging down the roads and 2 German mountain divisions outflanking defensive positions in the valleys, the plan nearly succeeded in trapping the British. By the 12th of April, the British commander, General Wilson, knew that the Germans were about to outflank him on the east. He ordered an evacuation southwards. By the 14th, those forces which had got away were setting up defences along the line of the Aliakmon River and the passes round Mount Olympus. They held the flood of German armour and infantry for 4 days, while lorries full of exhausted men, trudging files of troops, and farm carts packed with bewildered Greek families and their belongings fled south. They were harried mercilessly by Stukas and machine-gunned by fighters. But the Allied positions were again being outflanked. German armour was driving for Ioannina and the Thessaly region to the west. The British fell back to the ancient battlefield of Thermopylae on the 18th of April. British intelligence provided General Wilson with a stream of deciphered German signals that helped keep the withdrawal one step ahead of the advancing Germans. No mean trick, given the mobility and tactical initiative of German commanders. On the 19th of April, Commonwealth troops were streaming back past Thermopylae, the rear guards digging in for yet another last stand. Already Royal Navy ships were evacuating base personnel from Piraeus. But 50,000 men could not be lifted from one port, so the troops were sent south to keep open the bridge over the Corinth Canal and to guard the open beaches on the Peloponnesian coast, preparing for a Dunkirk-style evacuation. The Greek commander, General Papagos, advised his king on the 21st of April that the Greek army could fight no more. To General Wilson, he said that the British promise to fight alongside the Greeks had been faithfully kept, but now the time had come for them to go. The rear guards at Thermopylae held on until the 24th of April, then slipped away. General Wilson left Athens on the morning of the 26th of April and crossed the Corinth Bridge, glad to know that he had been preceded by over 40,000 men. But an orderly evacuation was imperiled on that day by a daring coup de main. German paratroops landed nearby to capture the bridge, and German gliders landed in support. The bridge was blown up even as the Germans raced over it searching for the charges, dropping them and the bridge neatly into the canal below. For the next 2 days, only the Luftwaffe could harass the Commonwealth evacuation, and this they did, sinking one transport and 2 destroyers on the night of the 26th of April. But the Royal Navy carried on. 21,000 men were lifted off 5 open beaches on the 27th. Shortly after dawn on the 28th of April, 5th Panzer Division and the SS Leibstandarte crossed the Corinth Canal and drove south. The panzers headed for Kalamata, where after a vicious fight it became obvious that no ships would be able to get in to rescue the 7,000 Imperial troops still there. Many of these had fought in all the rear guards from the Vevey Gap southwards. The British and Commonwealth troops laid down their arms after exhausting their ammunition. German troops entered Athens on the 27th of April. Others embarked in commandeered local vessels to occupy the Ionian islands of Samothrace, Lesbos and Chios. In keeping with the strict timetable for Operation Barbarossa, the invasion of the Soviet Union, the bulk of the German invasion force began withdrawing in May, leaving Greece to be held by a mixture of German reserve units and Italians. Greek losses in the brief campaign were almost 16,000 dead and missing, and nearly 250,000 taken prisoner. Italy lost over 90,000 dead, wounded or missing. For Germany, the cost was nearly 5,000 dead and wounded. The British lost nearly 4,000 dead, wounded or missing, and 9,000 prisoners of war. But more importantly, 50,000 British and Commonwealth soldiers lived to fight another day, plucked from the Greek fishing ports and open beaches by the Royal Navy. Many of the troops were evacuated to Crete. They assumed that the next stop would be Egypt and a welcome break from the war. What they did not know was that the Germans were planning to make the world's first full-sized airborne assault. The last battle for Greek territory was about to begin. To the British and Commonwealth forces who were on the receiving end, the airborne attack on Crete in May 1941 could have come from a science fiction film. Wearing high-laced rubber-soled boots and carrying submachine guns, the German paratroops in their zippered jump smocks could almost have come from another planet. This contrasted with the ordinary British soldier who still wore thick serge uniforms, leather gaiters, and was armed with a bolt-action rifle dating from the 19th century. Crete lay to the south of Greece. It was a large island, 275 kilometers long and up to 48 kilometers wide. It had a good anchorage for warships at Suda Bay and strategically placed airstrips at Malame, Retimo and Heraklion. For Hitler and his planners, Crete presented a potential problem. Royal Navy warships based at Suda could seize control of the Aegean and Ionian seas. Should the RAF base bombers on Cretan airfields, they would be within range of the Romanian oil fields at Ploesti, and Romanian oil was going to be vital to the success of Operation Barbarossa. But in German hands, those airfields would be invaluable for attack on British positions in Egypt or Libya, and ideal for harassing British shipping in the southern Mediterranean. Crete would have to be neutralized. Such a task was easier said than done. Though the Axis powers enjoyed local air superiority, they did not command the sea. The Italian fleet had been severely mauled by the Royal Navy and was in no position to support a major amphibious operation. However, British warships would not be a factor if the attack came from above, and it was decided to mount a major airborne assault. This was not without its risks. German paratroops, Fallschirmjäger, had achieved great success in small unit actions on the Western Front in 1940, but an airborne invasion was a whole order of magnitude greater. Unlike most of the major combatants in World War II, whose airborne forces were part of the army, the elite German parachute and glider-borne troops were part of the Luftwaffe. Though this had some operational disadvantages when fighting alongside the Wehrmacht, it provided a unique bond between the transport pilots and ground attack aircraft crew who supported the paratroopers in combat on the ground. German intelligence about the island and garrison was patchy. They knew that there were about 6,000 British and Greek troops stationed on Crete, but did not know that numbers had been swelled by 27,000 men who had been evacuated from Greece, though most had had to leave their arms and equipment on the mainland. Almost all the troops lifted off the Peloponnesian beaches had been taken to Crete, thus releasing the ships for a quick return to pick up more of the hard-pressed British and Anzacs. There were also some 400,000 Cretans who in the event would prove valiant supporters, though unskilled. In addition, there were 14,000 Italians who had been taken prisoner in Albania. They all had to be fed, and now the only source of everything the island needed to exist, let alone to fight off an invader, was Egypt. The only supply route was across the Mediterranean from Alexandria. Crete is dominated by a steep and narrow mountain range, which falls sharply to the sea along the south coast, but which in the north leaves 3 areas of flatter ground. The westernmost of these is around Hania and Suda Bay, and included the airfield at Malame. The center area is around Retimo, and the most eastern area is around Heraklion, both with their own airfields. The German plan of attack was the result of a compromise. Generaloberst Alexander Law of Luftflotte 4 was in overall command of the operation. He favored landings around Hania and Malame in the west and a thrust eastward along the island. Commanding the paratroopers was Generalleutnant Kurt Student, one of the founding fathers of the German airborne forces. He wanted landings at 3 points: Hania Malame, Retimo in the west of the island, and Heraklion in the center. The compromise was a 2-phase attack. Phase 1 consisting of a drop on Hania and Malame on the morning of the 20th of May, with further drops on Retimo and Heraklion in the afternoon. But these were the areas in which New Zealand General Bernard Freyberg had concentrated his defense. There were 2 brigades around Malame, supported by 3 Greek battalions. At Suda Bay, 3 battalions reinforced the 2,000 men of the original garrison force. 3 Australian and 2 Greek battalions were posted at Retimo. At Heraklion he deployed another 5 battalions. In all, the defending force numbered around 40,000 troops by the 7th of May. General Wavell, commander of British forces in the Middle East, helped as much as circumstances allowed. From his depots, he scraped 22 obsolete light tanks and infantry tanks with some worn-out artillery in addition. They trained, they dug defences, and they waited. The Germans were also preparing. The men, aircraft and equipment necessary for the assault were scattered through France, Germany and Greece. There was a lot of message traffic as the force was gathered, and as coded signals passed back and forth, they were intercepted. For years after the Battle of Crete, the Allied cover story for their initial effective reaction to the airborne assault was to say that tactics had been based on a Luftwaffe manual captured during fighting in Holland in 1940. In fact, thanks to British success in decoding the German ultra signals, Freyberg knew the enemy plans almost as well as the German paratroopers who were about to land. The main strike component of Luftflotte 4 was Generalstudent's Flieger Corps 11. This comprised Flieger Division 7 with a fighting strength of around 8,000 men. General-Major Conrad commanded the transport element of the corps, nearly 500 Ju-52 trimotor transports and 72 DFS 230 gliders. Air support was provided by Flieger Corps 8 under the command of Generalleutnant Freiherr von Richthofen. This comprised 180 fighters, over 200 dive bombers, and a similar number of medium bombers. Although almost exclusively a Luftwaffe operation, the invasion relied on the army for follow-up troops. These consisted of the 5th Gebirgsjäger Division under Generalleutnant Julius Ringel, whose 3 mountain rifle regiments and single motorcycle battalion were to be flown into action once the paratroopers had secured an airfield. 2 further battalions of mountain troops would come by sea. Their vehicles, anti-aircraft guns, field artillery and support engineers were to be transported in 2 waves aboard Greek fishing boats, escorted by Italian motor torpedo boats. On each morning prior to the attack, German aircraft had been arriving overhead, either on reconnaissance or on the nuisance missions Allied troops called the Morning Hate. However, at dawn on the 20th of May, the note and emphasis was entirely different. German fighters wove along the north coastal strip between Mallarmé and Retimo. They strafed and shot up anything that moved. There were so many of them that to one startled observer there seemed to be a Messerschmitt or a Stuka for every human target. Then, as men ducked into their trenches, a new note sounded, a prolonged buzz like that of an approaching swarm of angry bees. As it rose in a crescendo, the New Zealanders around Mallarmé saw a huge fleet of transport planes come in towards them across the sea. As they arrived overhead, the sky blossomed with parachutes, dangling men and containers. The battle for Crete had begun. The first assault troops to arrive, the spearhead of Group West, were 500 glider troops delivered to the airfield at Mallarmé, followed by over 1,800 paratroopers. The garrison reacted aggressively. Many Germans were killed as they floated down on their parachutes or as they struggled out of their harnesses. Some of the gliders crashed, killing their passengers. The Germans did, however, manage to achieve a foothold to the west of Mallarmé airfield and around Hania, but they were hard-pressed. In the afternoon, the second wave of paratroops was dropped at Retimo and Heraklion. The fire coming up to meet them was just as devastating as at Mallarmé. This time, the paratroopers did not have the element of surprise. The survivors of the Retimo drop were reduced to two groups, besieged in a chapel and an olive oil factory. At the Luftwaffe operational headquarters in Athens, Student decided that reinforcements should only be committed to Group West. A Ju-52 transport, flown by Captain Clare, had managed to land at Mallarmé, albeit under small arms fire, in the afternoon of the 20th. Reinforcing was risky, but was considered possible. In the confusion of the battle, two understrength New Zealand battalions covering Mallarmé and Point 107, the high grounds which dominated the airfield, were convinced that they were being outflanked. They pulled back on the night of the 20th. It was a move that would prove critical, since their withdrawal left Point 107 unoccupied. Fire from that high ground which dominated the airfield would have prevented its use for reinforcement. Things were going even worse for the German seaborne attack. During the nights of the 21st and 22nd of May, the Royal Navy intercepted and sank most of the seaborne elements of Ringel's mountain division. 3 cruisers and a number of destroyers made short work of the fishing boats, and the glare of the searchlights and flashes of gunfire could be seen by the soldiers in Hania and Mallarmé, less than 30 kilometers away. On the dawn of the 21st, German patrols discovered that Point 107 was undefended. With Mallarmé airfield almost secure, the Germans piled on the pressure. Student committed his last reserve. On the 22nd, 1,950 troops were landed, and by the following day, the total reached 3,650. On the 22nd, the paratroops and men of the Mountain Division started to push eastward to link up with their comrades at Hania. Under constant air attack, the British and Commonwealth garrison began to pull back. General Freyberg, with victory snatched from his grasp, realized reluctantly that he would have to order the evacuation of Crete. The only viable port for the Royal Navy to evacuate troops from around Hania and Mallarmé was the tiny fishing port of Sfakia on the south coast. However, by now the Germans held the village of Galatas straddling the road south. On the 25th, 2 New Zealand companies were ordered to clear the village. The 2 companies found their numbers swelled by individuals and groups who were eager for revenge against the Germans. New Zealand, Australian and British troops, who only a few days earlier had had the enemy on the run, were determined to prove that they could do it again. Yelling a Maori haka and supported by 2 light tanks, the men charged into the village and drove the Germans out, clearing the road south. On the 26th of May, General Freyberg ordered a withdrawal over the mountains to the south coast, and asked General Wavell to begin organization of an evacuation from the beaches at the village of Sfakia. On the 28th, the last rearguard action in the plains was fought. The long trudge over the White Mountains was in progress. British commandos formed a perimeter across the ridges and ravines above Sfakia, through which the exhausted remnants of Freyberg's command made their painful way. All the time the Germans were pushing southwards, and Stukas harassed the retreating Allied soldiers. The Royal Navy, with Narvik, Dunkirk and Greece behind them, was only too accustomed to the part in the drama that now occurred. They began taking troops off the beachhead on the 27th of May. Altogether, they lifted off over 16,000 men and took them back to Alexandria. Luftwaffe attacks wrought havoc during the evacuation. So high were the losses, 3 cruisers and 6 destroyers sunk, and 17 warships damaged, that the evacuation was abandoned on the 30th, leaving 5,000 men to be taken prisoner. At Heraklion, the Royal Navy was able to evacuate the garrison. But at Retimo, which had put up the most effective defense, they were all taken prisoner. British and Commonwealth losses were 4,000 killed, missing or wounded, with a further 11,000 captured. The Royal Navy lost 2,000 men killed and nearly 200 wounded. When the fighting was over, unfounded rumours circulated that Cretan civilians had murdered German paratroopers. The Cretans suffered a harsh occupation, which began with the execution of 700 men whom the Germans regarded as francs-tireurs, civilian snipers. In 4 months, the occupation forces executed 1,135 Cretans and destroyed 4 villages. For the German airborne forces, it had been a Pyrrhic victory. Of the 8,500 men dropped or landed by glider on Crete, 44% were killed, the majority on the first day. As Churchill was later to put it, the very spearhead of the German lance had been shattered. As for the Preußen aircraft, nearly half of the German transports had been destroyed. Losses were so high that Hitler came to a similar conclusion as the British Prime Minister. Some days later, he decorated the more outstanding of the officers who had fought in Crete, then entertained them to lunch. Over coffee, he turned to Student and said, "Of course you know, General, that we shall never do another airborne operation. Crete proved that the days of parachute troops are over." With these words, the Führer ensured that the superbly trained German Fallschirmjäger would no longer be used in airborne assaults and would be expended as infantry. Hitler was proved wrong, as Allied forces were to show later in the war. Apart from a few small operations, German paratroops would never again be used on such a scale. They may have captured Crete in May 1941, but the island proved to be the grave of the German paratroop arm.